When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored. I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this program, we reveal how a forensic scientist used DNA technology to help solve a brutal murder case.
DNA matching an individual that is linked to a blood stain. This is something special. This is a breakthrough.
And in Northern Ireland, police investigating a local man's murder are helped by an expert in mobile phone data analysis.
Having somebody physically turn a phone off as they arrive at the scene of an offence, I believe, is incriminating.
People go to great lengths to hide what they've done. Oftentimes, the bloodstains can actually map out what happened and also lead to ultimately identifying who may be responsible.
Flowers mark the spot where Victoria Agnete lost her life, murdered in her own car as she prepared to leave for work. This is a quiet and relatively crime-free little housing estate. There's even a children's playground at the heart of it. Hard to imagine that just a few yards from that children's playground, a 53-year-old woman could be stabbed to death in a frenzied attack on her own front doorstep.
Crime journalist Ron K. Phillips took a particular personal interest in this story.
This case caught my eye for two reasons, really. The first being that Dr. Agnete is from West Africa, and I am as well. She has a very similar background to many members of my family, but I suppose the thing that really struck me was how and why was this woman killed on the drive of her own house in her own car. It really was quite unusual.
Consultant forensic psychologist Dr. Kerry Nixon also looked in detail at the Victoria Agnete case.
Victoria was an upstanding member of the community. She had a good job, she was respected in her job, she was respected amongst the community. She had a very close relationship with her only child, her son Andrew. And in Ghana, she had actually saved the life of a child of a judge and his wife. And later on, the son of the judge, David Quarty, decided to move to the UK because he wanted to study in London with the dream of becoming a lawyer.
She offered to be his guardian, and not just that, she went one step further. She also offered to let him stay in her home, and they built up a really close relationship to the extent that she called him son and he called her mum. I mean, the relationship was so close that he really was another member of the family.
It was this young man, David Quarty, and Victoria's teenage son Andrew, the two people closest to her, who discovered her body in the car that Tuesday morning.
Even from outside the car, it was possible to see there was an incredible amount of blood. Now, David Quarty tried to open the driver's car door. When that didn't open, he ran round the car and entered the car from the passenger side. The police were called shortly after that, and they arrived to find that she had been stabbed several times, and as we know, it later emerged she'd actually suffered 56 separate stab wounds.
Police knew that the huge volume of blood at the scene could provide valuable evidence. Forensic scientist Joe Millington was called in to help bring order to the otherwise chaotic crime scene.
We can learn a lot about what activities took place from the way that the bloodstains develop. If I strike or deliver a blow into wet blood, I create what we call impact spatter, which is essentially droplets of blood that have been projected from that point of force. If I have blood on my hands and I flick it, I can create what we call cast-off blood. The role of a bloodstain pattern analyst is to identify each of these features and then give a determination as to how blood was deposited. It's a really important tool from a forensic perspective because it can help to tell the story of a crime.
Police say it is possible Dr. Agnete may have been murdered by a former patient or their relatives, but so far there's no motive, no suspects.
It is possible that someone may have been waiting for Dr. Agnete when she came out of her house.
The police actually had a working theory that somebody had perhaps broken into the car, or maybe she'd left it unlocked, that they'd laid in wait in the back of the car, and then when she got in, they attacked her. But their working theory, to my mind, just didn't stack up with the blood staining, because the blood staining was comprehensive. It had stained almost every surface of the car, and if someone had been in that space, then you would naturally expect there to be a void. And so that helped, I suppose, to fine-tune the hypothesis and to try and work out, well, actually, if somebody's not in the back of the car waiting for her, then how has this come about?
As Jo and her team started to process all of the evidence taken from the scene, details of this horrific attack started to emerge.
This is a representation, essentially, of the roof lining in Dr. Agnete's car. This blood is telling quite a lot of the narrative of the crime and how it evolved. So you can see how some of the blood staining here has these kind of dot-like features throughout it. And in fact, this turned out to be transfer marks from Dr. Agnete's hair braids, which came into contact with the roof lining. Here we've got a complete handprint. So my suggestion is that Victoria Agnete, having had blood from herself on her hands, has literally put her hand up onto the roof lining, probably to try and escape from her attacker.
Samples from the bloodstains were sent off for routine DNA analysis, while the team focused on a more unusual piece of evidence.
It looked like a stone initially, a small ivory-coloured thing, but it turned out to be a prosthetic tooth. During the post-mortem of Dr. Agnete, it was established that one of her front teeth was a prosthetic and it was missing. So it demonstrated that she must have bitten down on something. And of course the proposition was that perhaps she bit her offender.
This theory would bear fruit when the results of the routine DNA analysis from the bloodstains on the car roof came through.
I go back to the laboratory thinking to myself, all of this DNA is going to be a match to Dr. Agnete. And so I'm looking for female profiles and see whether or not there's anything out of sorts. And in and amongst the results, there's a male DNA profile. It's like, what's going on? And it turned out that the profiles matched David Quarty. Now, DNA is tricksy because we leave DNA all the time on things that we touch, on things that we handle. Finding DNA matching an individual is not breaking news. However, DNA matching an individual that is linked to a bloodstain, this is unusual. This is something special. This is a breakthrough.
Using hundreds of separate DNA samples from the car's roof lining, the forensics team could now clearly identify which marks were made by Quarty.
Orange means that the DNA matched Dr. Agnetti, and blue means that it matched David Quorty. And this correlates with some finger swipes that have been placed on the roof lining. Why would he have his own blood on his hand and be coming into contact with the roof? And of course, it turned out that he had sustained this injury on his finger. When he was questioned about it, he said that after they'd removed her body from the vehicle, he was so overwrought by the experience of it that he'd bitten down on his own finger and he'd created this injury and it had bled. But the injury was looked at in more detail, and they established that the injury itself matched the false tooth that Dr. Agnetti wore. And it completely blew his alibi, his account out of the water ultimately.
A 21-year-old man has been charged with the murder of the consultant paediatrician, Dr. Victoria Agnetti. The man will appear before Maidstone magistrates later today.
The thing about this murder is it's one of those ones that you look at and it's almost that you just can't understand it, because he seemed to love and respect Victoria. He called her mum. You know, he was living in her house and he wanted to be there. He seemed to be quite a quiet character. And something that I think is really important here is to understand what we call over-controlled hostility, where somebody is aggressive and angry inside, but is controlling it. So appears placid on the outside, but actually underneath is this building resentment.
The tension between the two of them began when it emerged that Quorty had failed his end-of-term exams, and then the following year he failed another 3 exams. Now, when he was asked about it, he lied and said he hadn't got the results yet, but his student visa was dependent on him passing all his exams. So Dr. Agnetti checked herself, found out he had failed, and she confronted him.
He was under an enormous amount of family pressure. His father was a judge. His father expected him to achieve, to become a lawyer, to excel academically. But he was also under a lot of cultural expectations and cultural pressures. Failure isn't an option. It simply isn't an option. And he would have seen Victoria as the pinnacle of that, because it was her that on a daily basis was telling him that he had to study. So she would have bore the brunt of all that building frustration.
On that final day, it's reported that Dr. Agnetti had told her son Andrew that Quorty was scaring her. And of course, we now know that his final report card was found inside her purse after she was murdered. So it seems she had every intention of going to work and calling his parents to tell them that he'd failed his exams once again.
Using all the evidence they had now discovered, Jo and her team were able to piece together in chilling detail how the attack had most likely unfolded.
So I imagine she got into the driver's side to drive her vehicle to work, and I imagine that he came to the door and started to attack her there. As soon as she started to sustain stab injuries to her chest, it was evident that she'd tried to go into the back of the vehicle, trying to climb through between the front passenger and the driver's seat. And in doing that, her head had come into contact with the roof lining and she dripped excessive blood staining into the back of the car. That also exposed her back to more injury, which presumably at that stage is when, during the struggle, she bit down on the hand of her assailant, which was David Quorty. Then, coming back into the driver's seat, the door had become closed and she'd managed to lock herself in there. And I imagine that that's when the assault stopped.
A student from Ghana has been found guilty of killing the doctor whose home he'd been staying in. 22-year-old David Quorty has been jailed for 15 years.
As he sentenced him, the judge said that he had gravely abused the trust placed in him by Dr. Agnetti, and he called the attack brutal and frenzied.
In this case, we have the loss of a mother who was the sole carer for her son. So Andrew lost his mum that day just because of a sense of shame and pressure, which is just, it's a tragic loss of life.
I think it's important to recognise that forensic science had a really key place in that case, because if we hadn't have dealt with the evidence in the way that we did, and we hadn't been able to rebut his account in the way that we did, it might not have been solved, and so that would have been completely unacceptable.
Cell site analysis is able to place a mobile phone in a general location. Everybody's got a mobile phone, including suspects in serious cases. They go, oh, the prosecution must have got it wrong. That's not my phone. I wasn't there. And I come back going, it's your phone. You were there.
June 2019. Coulson Avenue, Lisbon, in Northern Ireland. 50-year-old Paul Smith is found dead in the living room of his home.
It was a female friend who discovered Mr. Smith's body slumped on the sofa, covered in blood.
Belfast Crown Court reporter Ashley MacDonald covered every development of the case for the Belfast Telegraph.
A neighbour actually entered Paul's house. She hadn't seen him for a few days and there were concerns about his well-being. She saw him slumped in his settee. There was blood in his T-shirt, there was blood in his chest, and it was very obvious that Paul was dead.
Police confirmed that Paul had died from a single gunshot wound to the chest at close range. His violent death was out of keeping with what neighbours knew of the man.
He lived on his own. He had friends and neighbours calling in at him on regular occasions, but he did seem to live quite an isolated life in that he very, very rarely left the house.
The community was left in shock. Fear spread right across this small city at what many believed was a robbery gone wrong.
It had a massive effect on the people of Lisburn because this is quite rare. So the police had to act quickly for the protection of the public and for the public's peace of mind also.
Detectives began their investigation by studying CCTV footage of the area around Paul Smith's house at the time of the murder. One person caught their attention.
They could see a man in and around his flat at that time. This man was seen wearing a very distinctive grey tracksuit and a Northern Ireland football scarf.
Police could not identify the man from the footage, but circulated details of his clothing. Within days, officers investigating a separate incident made an extraordinary discovery at the house of this man, James McVeigh. A man with a long record of criminal violence.
The police in Lisburn had occasion to call to his house for a completely unrelated matter, and while they were there, they looked in his house and saw this very distinctive grey tracksuit and a Northern Ireland scarf drying in his living room.
Officers seized the scarf and tracksuit and sent them for forensic analysis. Meanwhile, they looked more closely at James McVeigh, including his activity online.
The police always maintained that the motive for this murder was in fact robbery, and in the hours after Paul was murdered, James McVeigh placed a picture of himself with a wad of cash on his Facebook page, which police believe were the proceeds of the crime.
This theory was soon supported by the forensic analysis of McVeigh's scarf. It revealed discharge from a shotgun cartridge that matched residue found on items at Paul Smith's home. Compelling evidence, but not enough to prove McVeigh was at the scene of the crime. For that, detectives turned to the suspect's mobile phone and an expert witness.
Cell site analysis is indicating the potential location of a mobile phone. And we do that using the call records which are produced by the network. Those call records can be obtained by the police and include all details of all the events that your phone undertakes, whether that be text message, voice call, mobile data sessions, and which cell ID was used to make that connection.
A cell is the device that transmits and receives mobile phone signals.
If you look to the top of the mast, there are some white plates, and those plates are cells, and each of those cells has a specific cell ID number, which identifies that cell from all the others in the UK.
The cell ID number is recorded each time a mobile phone connects to it, creating a data record which Paul can gather during a process called RF surveying.
As I'm walking along, the phones are recording the cells that it's seeing. At the same time as it's recording the cell that it's seeing, it's recording the exact position that that measurement is being made. And that will create a really good map showing me exactly which cells provide coverage to that specific small area.
By analysing this cell site's data record, Paul can determine the location of a mobile phone at any given time.
The red dots are where that measurement of a cell was the cell that I'm interested in. These are all the locations we found in that area where that phone could have been.
Police hoped he could use the data record for James McVeigh's phone to reveal his movements on the night of the murder.
I was also provided with a potential route that the suspect had used the towpath of the Largan to get from his home address to the scene of the offence. As a result, we carried out RF surveying along that route as well as at other significant locations.
Paul studied the cells that provided coverage along the towpath and those providing coverage around the crime scene. He was hoping to show McVeigh's phone was at Paul Smith's home when the murder took place. The results were promising.
It indicated that McVeigh's phone travelled from his home address to the towpath of the Largan and then went up the towpath of the Largan to Colson Avenue itself.
Paul's results were proving exactly what detectives had suspected. But then there was a problem.
Just as it reached the scene, there was a gap in the data. I wasn't able to indicate during the period that was most crucial to the case the location of the phone. I can't tell where a phone is unless I've got the data. And on this occasion, we got to the crucial point where the phone is potentially at the scene and nothing.
Paul's only hope was to dig even deeper into the network data.
Certain networks provide signalling event data, and that is communication between the phone and the network, which the user of the phone has no involvement in. And that was a detached notification which indicated that the phone had been physically turned off. So what we've got is the phone travelling up the towpath, arriving at the scene, and shortly after arriving at the scene, McVeigh turns his phone off. There's then a gap of half an hour, and when the phone is turned on again, it has left the scene and is on its way back using the towpath. Having somebody physically turn a phone off as they arrive at the scene of an offence is suspicious and, I believe, is incriminating.
Detectives now had enough evidence to charge McVeigh with murder. They believed, despite his quiet appearance, the victim Paul Smith was a small-time drug dealer and that he had quantities of cash in his home. In the week before the murder, James McVeigh had been informed of this by a person he knew.
He had been there to buy drugs for himself, for his own personal use. He had a conversation with James McVeigh along the lines of, there's a man up the street who has money in the house. Some kind of plot was formed, and a couple of days later, Paul Smith's dead. There are some people out there who may say that being a drug dealer, he deserved what he got, but I don't believe that for 1 minute. If the suggestion is correct, he sold drugs on a very, very small scale, and I don't think anybody deserves to be shot in their own living room at point-blank range with a shotgun.
Detectives submitted their case. Key to it was Paul Hope's cell site analysis.
Mobile phone evidence is always very, very compelling, and you can't argue with it. There are masts everywhere, and a lot of criminals aren't aware that ultimately they will get caught for their crimes by their mobile phones and by this mobile phone evidence, so it's becoming a lot more prevalent in courts.
Nonetheless, McVeigh continued to protest his innocence, and a trial was set for September 2021 at Belfast Crown Court. But then, there was a dramatic turn of events.
The trial was ready to proceed. There was a jury sworn. They were informed by the judge that the trial was due to last around a month.
Normally, I would produce evidence and I would give that evidence orally in a trial. This was unusual in that my evidence was served on the defence, so Mr. McVeigh had an opportunity to look at that evidence.
Just as the Crown was about to open its case, James McVeigh, who up until this point had denied the murder, turned his play around and confessed to killing Paul Smith.
It's very unusual to have somebody plead guilty to a murder charge. So it was a bit of a shock, really. I was very pleased that the police were happy with my work and that eventually they got a conviction against clearly a guilty man.
On the 25th of April 2022, James McVeigh was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison.
If your phone is turned off and we have a gap in the data, that might appear to most people that that would be the end of the matter and there's nothing we can do. But sometimes, depending on when and where that phone is when it's been turned off, and when and where that phone is when it's turned on again, can be quite crucial evidence, and certainly was in this case.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this program, a scientist reveals how, for the first time, evidence from microscopic organisms helped solve a murder investigation.
So this was the first case that I'd ever taken this evidence to court, and it makes it a very, very nerve-wracking experience.
And how an expert witness found hidden clues to uncover a cunning fraud.
Of all the cases I have done over the years, this is one that has always stuck in my mind, which quite bamboozled everybody concerned.
Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime. My area of specialism is an area called diatoms, and they are single-celled bits of algae that live in soils, and we can use them to reconstruct that process of contact between a suspect and scene.
January 2021, Bransholme near Hull. A dog walker discovers the body of a boy on the bank of this river. It was 17-year-old Connor Lyons.
Throughout this morning, an underwater search team was looking for anything that could help the investigation, with divers scouring the riverbed and officers searching on canoes, with others looking through reeds close to where Connor's body was found.
Journalist Nick Britton reported on the case at the time.
An initial investigation of the body showed signs of strangulation and showed that Connor had been submerged in the water.
Police divers searching for evidence in the swollen River Hull today, more than 48 hours after the body of Connor Lyons was found here. They're asking anyone with information that could help with the investigation to contact them.
Connor Lyons was very much your typical 17-year-old, really. He had plans to go to college, he had plans to become a plumber. He really was looking to make something of his life. His parents described him as a very happy-go-lucky kid, somebody who was thoughtful and kind. He had 3 sisters and really was just a very typical teenager.
As the search continued, a steady stream of Connor's friends and family have been visiting the area to lay flowers and remember the teenager.
Connor's death left the community in shock. Detectives began to piece together his movements the day of his murder. They revealed Connor had gone hunting for rabbits or lamping with a friend.
Connor had taken with him his fairly distinctive-looking dog called Callie, which was a mix between a bull greyhound and a German shepherd.
The friend Connor went lamping with was 21-year-old Cole Jarvis. Police began looking into their relationship.
Connor Lyons and Cole Jarvis were, on the face of it, friends. They shared interests such as motorbikes and dogs, and Cole used to go around and play video games. But there was a sinister undertone to their friendship. Connor's friends say there was a violent part to their friendship, with Cole Jarvis being a bully, and a violent bully at that.
Further inquiries revealed that some of Connor's valuable possessions were missing.
Police found that missing from Connor was his mobile phone, an 800-pound bracelet, and his very distinctive mountain bike.
Witnesses came forward to say Jarvis was seen trying to sell Connor's bike in the hours after his death. Police were left with one conclusion.
It emerged fairly quickly that this person had lured him to this spot in order to rob him. Cole Jarvis was arrested, denied, though, that he'd seen Connor for at least 2 weeks. He denied that he'd even been ever to the stretch of river where Connor was found. But crucially, and of great interest to the police, was that he refused to give any account of his movements that night, and that raised suspicion immediately.
But detectives had a problem. There was very little evidence.
Interestingly, there was absolutely nothing to link the perpetrator of this crime to the scene.
Detectives had no way to prove Cole Jarvis had actually been at the scene of the crime. Even mobile phone records were no use.
Cole Jarvis's phone had been turned off some hours before, and Connor's phone had been switched off around the time of the murder. What that meant was that they couldn't put both people at the same place at the same time.
But a witness statement offered some hope. A passerby said he saw Connor's dog coming out of the bushes near the crime scene, followed by a man fitting Jarvis's description.
That was enough for police to get a search warrant for his address.
The search uncovered vital evidence: a blue rope, which forensic analysis revealed carried traces of Connor Lyon's DNA.
According to the post-mortem, the medical cause of death was drowning, but with evidence of strangulation. For the police to have found in their search the rope that had Connor's DNA on it, this of course was a highly important piece of evidence. On top of that, when police searched Cole Jarvis's grandmother's house, they found in her shed Connor's missing mountain bike.
On the strength of this evidence, Cole Jarvis was arrested and charged with murder. But still, neither the rope, nor the bike, nor the witness statement was enough to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Jarvis was at the scene of the crime.
What they needed was something very specific and irrefutable that would put Cole Jarvis at the scene of the murder.
What they had was the suspect's trainers, also seized during the search of Jarvis's house. Now detectives asked whether these might hold the evidence to place him at the scene of the crime. To know for sure, they turned to an expert witness, forensic ecologist Rosie Everett.
Soil is the broad area of forensic ecology where I use different elements of the environment to help police forces and wider criminal investigations understand the relationship between humans and the environment. So using forensic ecology to link a suspect to a scene is a challenge.
But Rosie was up for that challenge, and this case called for her expertise in single-celled organisms called diatoms.
So a diatom is a microscopic, so something that you can't see with the naked eye, unicellular, as in it's got one cell that supports its life system, and it's algae. So it is the algae that grows in slightly wet, slightly organic environments. So diatoms live in both soils and water, and different species will grow in different habitats. So we can talk about that unique structure of a soil associated with a scene based on the diatom population.
Rosie compared the number and variety of diatoms in soil samples taken from Jarvis's trainers with samples from the riverbank where Connor was killed.
So the diatoms in the Connor Lyons case were very variable with lots of different species and counts, which meant that we could build a really good profile for the River Hull area. Individual diatoms have what we call frustules. So they're the silica outline that makes a diatom. And we count these individually based on the identification. And the ratio is about the number of diatom species and how many counts there are of them. And then when I compared them, what we had was pretty much an exact match of not only the types of diatoms, but the amount of diatoms.
Rosie had revealed the scientific proof detectives needed. They could now show Cole Jarvis was present at the crime scene.
To not only look at a piece of footwear that had diatoms retained on them, but they were comparable to the scene, that was actually very exciting. It was a relief to be able to phone the police and say, I think we've got a match between the footwear and the scene, and it puts them within a 200 to 300 metre buffer of where that victim was found.
On the 6th of October 2021, at Hull Crown Court, Cole Jarvis was tried for the murder of Connor Lyons. Rosie Everett's evidence was key to the prosecution's case.
So this was the first case that I'd ever taken diatom evidence to court. The atmosphere in court was tense, and it makes it a very, very nerve-wracking experience. And then you've got this jury and this panel in front of you that your questions are ultimately there to support. And the information that you're about to give is very sensitive. And it can either put that person that sat in front of you to prison, or it could leave uncertainty to the victim's family for the rest of their life.
But the jury was convinced by Rosie and her evidence. They took less than 5 hours to come to a unanimous verdict: guilty. Cole Jarvis was sentenced to at least 24 years in prison.
It was actually a very proud moment because we were thanked by the police for the forensic ecology and diatom input, because it was the diatom work that helped provide that conviction.
Rosie's evidence was absolutely critical in bringing Cole Jarvis to justice. Prior to that, what the police had built was a good case, but a lot of it was circumstantial evidence and something that a defence could argue against.
It was not only the first case that I took to court, but it was the first case that diatoms as trace evidence really supported a case and the criminal conviction process.
Forensic document examination largely revolved around forensic handwriting identification and signature authentication. But other examination types can reveal information that can be very telling, as in this case. It was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic document examination.
Rotherham, where Phil Turner spent his career working as a journalist for the Rotherham Advertiser.
Well, Rotherham is, it's a very lively news place. I worked there for 32 years and there's always something happening in Rotherham. That's what is exciting about being a reporter, is you never know what you're going to get.
Of the thousands of stories Phil covered in his time at the paper, one in particular stands out.
It was known as the chocolate box sting. It made the front page of my paper as an exclusive story, and also, got reported on elsewhere by other sections of the media. So, yeah, I think it was just an astounding, shocking story where it seemed, on the face of it, an 87-year-old registered blind elderly woman had been cheated out of her house.
Ambrosine Fretwell bought the house in question for £42,000 as an investment. And by 2005, it had significantly appreciated in value.
The house was on a semi-rural road out of Swinton, which is just outside Rotherham. It wasn't some big, mansion, but it was valued, I think, at £130,000.
Ambrosine had no intention of selling her house. So she was astonished when she was informed in December 2004 that it had been sold at auction and not by her, but by two men she had never heard of, Richard Skidmore and Robert Graves. They claimed she had already sold the house to them prior to the auction for just £5,000.
Their claim was that Mrs. Fretwell had agreed to sell the house for $5,000, which was a ridiculously low amount. They said that she wanted to sell it. I think the impression was that they wanted to give her more, but she didn't want more, so in the end, she sold it to them for $5,000.
Ambrosine insisted she had never agreed to any such sale, and that she had never even heard of Graves or Skidmore.
She was completely refuting the claims that she had wanted to sell it for $5,000, which would have been a complete giveaway, rock bottom price. So, you know, she was saying that was completely ridiculous and impossible that she would have done that.
But, to add to the mystery, Ambrosine appeared to have signed the legal documents agreeing to the £5,000 sale. Her family suspected a fraud and questioned whether the signature was genuine. When they reported the matter to the police, detectives immediately turned to expert witness Paul Bagnall.
Signatures are a very concentrated piece of handwriting. Some individuals literally just make a signature as a little bit of their handwriting. They just write their name. That goes right the way through to the other end of the spectrum to what we call stylized signatures, which could be elaborate. You may not even see any discernible letter constructions. But as an experienced expert witness and forensic handwriting identification expert, you are trained to determine how much information, how much forensic information is contained within a signature.
Paul began his analysis of Mrs. Fretwell's signature. He carefully studied how the letters had been formed and compared them with specimens of her own signature and handwriting that she had provided.
Her signature was very distinctive and contained a lot of information. And as she was quite elderly and partially sighted, there were certain elements of that signature with regards to, let's say, shakiness and unfluency that were very distinctive. So what is difficult for the forger is to be able to get the detail of the signature correct, but also at the same time get the fluency and line quality of the signature also correct. So if the forger were to slow down to get the detail, there would be lapses in the fluency which someone like myself could pick up. And the converse is true too. If they get the fluency and the line quality and the speed correct, then the chances are they've missed out a lot of the detail, and certainly the microscopic detail. Particularly if they want to speed it up, there's a very good chance that they drop into that signature elements of their own handwriting.
The family were convinced the signature would prove to be a fake, but Paul had some unexpected news.
So during the examination, I received a call from the solicitor in charge of the case, asking me how it was going, and I said, well, look, I'm not finished the examination, but I have to tell you that it looks like it's going to be a genuine signature of the elderly lady, which quite bamboozled everybody concerned. I found a high degree of overlap between the question signature on the land registry document and the specimens, which led me to the conclusion that there was very strong evidence that it was a genuine signature of Ambrosine St. Clair Fretwell. Much to his dismay, and perhaps not what he expected to hear.
Paul's evidence was unambiguous. The signature was genuine. Yet Ambrosine continued to insist she had never signed the document. Paul began to wonder whether there could be other clues within the document itself, and decided to take a closer look.
So even though you may be pointed to a specific part of a document, like maybe the printing or maybe the signature, as in this case, a forensic document examiner would, by their very nature, do a more holistic examination of the document, because other examination types can reveal information that can be very telling.
Paul was looking for any signs of paper clips, folds, marks, or anything unusual that could provide him with clues. What he discovered appeared to be an indented impression of Mrs. Fretwell's signature elsewhere on the same document.
So indented impressions of handwriting, as the name suggests, are the impressions that handwriting make when you lean on a piece of paper and the pressure of your hand on the pen indents that handwriting into the underlying sheets. So if you imagine, perhaps in the old days in the Sherlock Holmes movies, a darkened room, a light coming across the document, and Sherlock holding the piece of paper back and forward, eventually he can see what was written. But it's how they are actually bringing up the indented impressions of handwriting.
When Paul studied the indented impression, he could see that the impression of the signature was identical to the signature itself.
The indented impressions that I found were totally superimposable on the authentic ink signature. So in other words, the indented impressions that I found elsewhere in the document had not been made, for example, with the elderly lady making another signature, another version of her signature. These indented impressions come exactly from the signing of the document.
Paul's discovery helped explain for the very first time the circumstances in which Ambrosine signed the document.
Now, no two people write a signature alike twice. So I was able to glean from this evidence that the only way those indented impressions that I found elsewhere in the document could have been made is that the bottom portion of the document was folded underneath and back under itself. So as the lady signed her name here, she indented that signature into the reverse side of the document, which proved that at the point of signing, I could tell that when the signature was made, the details at the bottom, just along here, would have been out of view, and there were details on the top of the document that were also obscured too.
This revelation suggested the contents of the document were hidden from Ambrosine, meaning she was not aware of what she was signing.
That perhaps was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic document examination.
Now she knew she had been duped into signing, Ambrosine at last remembered how it happened. In the autumn of 2004, she received an unexpected parcel from a courier.
The parcel didn't have sufficient postage on it. She wasn't sure about it, thought it was a suspicious object. She then opened it and found it was chocolates.
The courier asked her to sign a form confirming delivery of the parcel. Ambrosine, who was partially sighted, did as she was asked. In fact, he was no courier, and the paperwork Ambrosine signed was actually a legal document transferring ownership of her house to David Graves and Richard Skidmore.
As she's signing, it appeared, for the chocolates, she was signing away the property for £5,000, property having been valued at 130 grand. Absolutely amazing brazen fraud.
A criminal prosecution against David Graves and Richard Skidmore did not succeed. But Ambrosine and her family took their own civil case. They won, and Ambrosine was awarded the full financial value of her house. Key to the judgment was the evidence from Paul Bagnall.
There are two sides to every dispute, especially when it gets to court. So as an expert witness, your main driver and responsibility is to fairly and based on your findings, balance those two sides up and come to a conclusion. Of all the cases I have done over the years, this is one that has always stuck in my mind. I've always been driven by fairness and correcting injustices, and this particular case in which an elderly, partially sighted lady was being defrauded is one such example.
So I used to drive past the house on my way to work and back every day, and it was boarded up for a long time. It's just an extraordinary story. This is lifting the lid on a little corner of Rotherham, where, you know, who would have thought that could have possibly happened? It just sounds like a made-up story, doesn't it?
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. Some criminal investigations are so complicated, they involve a number of expert witnesses. In this programme, we examine how forensic evidence from a whole team of scientists turned a missing person case into the hunt for a murderer, and then into an investigation into one of Britain's most notorious serial killers.
Forensic biology, including DNA, has now become pivotal in convictions and solving many crimes. And we're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
Glasgow, September 2006. Across the city, police are searching for a 23-year-old woman, Angelica Kluk.
She is a responsible young woman. In the time she's been working, she's never been late for her job, and last night she failed to turn up.
Angelica was on her summer break from university in Poland. She was living and working at St. Patrick's Church. Angelica's sister, Anita, was desperate for her return.
She wouldn't just leave, walk away. She just wouldn't. I know her, she wouldn't. I really hope and I pray that Angelica will be back soon and she will be back in one piece and safe and sound.
Detectives began an extensive search of St. Patrick's and made a shocking discovery.
Police say a Polish student whose body was found in a church in Glasgow has suffered a horrific attack. 23-year-old Angelica Kluk, who'd been staying at the church, went missing last week.
Angelica's body was concealed beneath a trapdoor in the floor of the church, wrapped in bin bags. Detective Superintendent David Swindle was the senior investigating officer.
What happened to Angelica Kluck is absolutely horrific. It was aggravated even more by the fact it was in a church, a place of worship, a place where people should feel safe.
David was determined to find out what had happened to Angelica. He began by calling in expert witness and forensic biologist Carol Rogers, a specialist in gathering evidence from the bodies of murder victims.
You're only getting one shot at a crime scene. You've got to get it spot on so that nothing's compromised and that we gather the best evidence.
Carol's first step was to search Angelica's body where it was found. She was looking for clues to explain what's happened to her and who was responsible.
I was adamant from the get-go that I wanted Angelica to stay where she was in situ. And that posed difficulties because she was beneath a trapdoor which was tiny. We just have to fit down there and do our work. Every crime scene's a little bit different in the approach you're going to take. With Angelica's case, the fly of her trousers was undone and she had cable ties tied round her wrists and her hands. I could see this as a violent crime and it's likely to be sexually motivated. So the traces we're looking for are skin. Is there any DNA from a perpetrator? Body fluids that will give us DNA. Hairs, fibres, anything like that that could have come from the suspect onto Angelica.
Only when Carol's examination of the body was complete could Angelica be moved from beneath the floorboards. Then, bioarchaeologist Dr. Jennifer Miller took over the scene.
When most people think of archaeology, what comes to mind is Roman bathhouses, standing stones and ancient tombs, but forensic archaeology applies the same methods that would be used to excavate those ancient relics to modern-day crime scenes.
Jennifer's job was to carry out an excavation of the area where Angelica was hidden to recover any exhibits that could be relevant to the murder.
When you're recovering evidence round about a body, you set up a grid, which means that you can recover every piece of evidence or all material that could be evidence from that area below the floor in an accountable manner. If you don't do it properly, then that evidence may be lost. You only ever know what you find. You don't know what you miss. This is a representation of the grid that was created below the floor of the church. This would be what you would see as you look below that trapdoor for the first time. In amongst all that 120 years of dust, you've got things that are there relating to the construction of the church. But you've also got some unusual things. One of the interesting things we found was a dead, dried box bush leaf right beside the body. There's no reason on earth for a leaf of that kind to be underneath the floor.
Detectives were convinced it was significant. They found a box bush growing in the church grounds. Beside it, a stash of bin liners identical to those Angelica was wrapped in.
At this point, it became apparent that Angelica's body was in a deposition site. We didn't believe she'd been assaulted there.
Detectives needed to find the scene of the murder and expanded their search to other buildings on the church grounds.
The garage was full of tools, paint, bits of furniture, etc. And it had a grey concrete floor. And we just started looking and saw a blood spot on the floor, and then another blood spot, and then another blood spot. And then these are tiny little blood spots. Just started circling them, and within a short space of time, it was apparent we had a spatter of blood spots on the floor. And we found blood spots on the walls, on the ceiling. The picture we got was that Angelica had been assaulted within that garage.
Nearby, detectives found the likely murder weapon.
There was table legs recovered within the grounds of the church, and we found trace amounts of blood on one of the table legs.
Samples of wood that had been found in Angelica's hair and in the wounds in her head were identified as ash from the table leg.
Jennifer found even more intriguing clues from her excavation of the deposition site.
Some of the most relevant evidence that we found below the trapdoor are several flakes of green paint and a kind of grey-green paint.
Angelica was last seen painting a shed the same colour in the church grounds.
We found a brand new roofing nail. Angelica was helping make the shed in the garage with roofing nails which were identical to the one found beside her body.
A box leaf, paint from the shed, blood in the garage. For Detective David Swindle, it all pointed to one person, the church handyman, Pat McLaughlin.
He actually gave a statement saying that that day his little apprentice, as he called her, was working in the church painting.
But Pat McLaughlin had disappeared, and inquiries revealed he had a dark past.
The concerns were pretty evident at that time that the person named Patrick McLaughlin was not Patrick McLaughlin. His name was Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender.
Peter Tobin was now the prime suspect, and detectives began a nationwide manhunt.
They get an update from the Metropolitan Police that Peter Tobin was in a hospital in a false name. We didn't have evidence to say Tobin had murdered Angelica Kluck. There was a warrant in existence for Tobin in relation to breaching his sex offenders order, so he was detained on that.
As police made the journey to question Tobin, lab testing began on the evidence Carol had recovered from Angelica's body.
So the first stage to the laboratory work would be examining the swabs that were taken from Angelica's body, just to check for any body fluids, anything that might obtain a DNA profile from that could provide a name for the police. There's different qualities of DNA profiles depending on the source. So if you have blood, which has a lot of DNA, you're going to get a nice full DNA profile. If you're looking at skin cells or a trace amount of DNA, you might get a partial profile, or quite often you also get a mixed DNA profile, which means there's more than one source of DNA, and then that has to be interpreted quite carefully. So from the examination of Angelica's swabs, we got a full male DNA profile.
Carol ran the profile against the national database, and she hit the jackpot.
We got the call that the DNA had been identified as Tobin's. And that is a real break.
And the DNA evidence didn't end there.
So when Peter Tobin was arrested, his possessions were seized, and we got quite a lot of forensic evidence. On the lower front of his T-shirt, we found a stain that was a mix of DNA that matched Angelica Kluck and Peter Tobin. And we also found blood that matched Angelica on the bracelet of his watch.
To David, the forensic evidence revealed what had happened in Angelica's final moments.
He had taken advantage of Angelica Kluck, his friend who trusted him. He had hit her over the head with a table leg, and then whatever happened thereafter, he had dragged her in a plastic sheet across the yard into the church and dropped her in underneath the floor. That is the most likely sequence of event that happened.
On the 23rd of March 2007, Tobin faced trial at the High Court in Edinburgh. Carol's forensic evidence was the cornerstone of the case against Tobin.
I was 2.5 days in total giving evidence, which is probably still to this day the longest I've stood in the witness box giving evidence. It's really tough, but the forensic evidence was compelling and it spoke for itself, really.
A convicted sex offender has been found guilty of the rape and murder of a Polish student.
Peter Tobin always denied what he did. Today, he was defiant to the end. He was described by the judge as an evil man and a danger to women.
Peter Tobin was sentenced to life in prison. It was justice for Angelika.
But that was only the start of what was to happen as regards Peter Tobin. There was an element of organisation, methodology about this. And this is someone that travelled throughout the UK. He used aliases. We knew from his index offence, he was a sex offender, that he had tried to kill 2 young women in Avant near Portsmouth. And he had seriously sexually assaulted them and left them for dead. I believed that he'd killed other people.
David Swindle was convinced Angelika Clark was not Peter Tobin's first victim, so he launched Operation Anagram to examine Tobin's life. Where was he living? What was he doing? What nearby crimes remained unsolved? His investigations led him to 2 murder cold cases, but only evidence from expert witnesses could reveal if these were also the work of Peter Tobin.
Cold cases are particularly challenging for forensic science, but thanks to advancements in technology, we can now uncover evidence and uncover secrets that have been hidden for decades.
Bathgate, Scotland, 1991. 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton was visiting her sister and was last seen waiting at a bus stop, but she never made it home. Her father, Michael, reported her missing.
From day one, I started to worry. Definitely started to worry. I said, there's something not right here at all.
Divisional Commander of West Lothian Police, Tom Wood, immediately took action.
There's a number of options. What has happened? Has she sought shelter? Has she been picked up by somebody? We started to do a larger house-to-house and search, starting from the place where she was last seen and moving outwards. There was never any trace of Vicky.
A few weeks later, Vicky's purse was found in Edinburgh city centre. But the case went cold and her family were left without answers.
As the years go on, you say to yourself, there's nothing coming out of this. We were going to ever find Vicky.
It's very, very difficult because you don't have a body. You're not sure if a crime has been committed. You suspect it has, but you don't have really anywhere to start.
But 16 years later, Operation Anagram uncovered a shocking link.
What we didn't know at that time was that Peter Tobin lived not far away from the place she was last seen.
In 1991, Peter Tobin lived at Robertson Avenue in Bathgate, barely a mile from where Vicky Hamilton disappeared. New forensic developments meant examination of Vicky's purse could finally yield results.
Originally, it had been looked at and it was a mixed profile, nothing could be done with it. But with advances in technology, we were able to obtain a DNA profile and it was a familial match. And I believe the match was with someone who could be a son of Peter Tobin.
When Vicky disappeared, Tobin had a 3-year-old son. Now, police suspected Tobin had given him the purse to play with. But Tobin was refusing to help.
Is there any way that you can assist us
in finding this girl now?
No.
Her parents don't know, or her father doesn't know where she is, her family, we don't know.
Sorry, I can't help you. We have nothing there. As I say, I've never met her.
Experts were called to examine Tobin's former home. Peter Faulding, a forensic search specialist, was one of them.
I get brought in to look at cold cases. People have been missing a number of years, and looking at search strategies that could potentially find these people. The top of the garden was a key focus because we had intelligence from the neighbour that he dug a large hole in the garden many years earlier.
Jennifer Miller was once again called to the scene.
Our main area of interest was a very unusual rockery, which had no purpose in being there in the garden. It just looked out of place. And from experience, things that look out of place usually are out of place. We had to go below the ground surface and then continue below that. So we had to go quite far down. Thereafter, the geophysics equipment was brought in.
One of the pieces of kits used was ground-penetrating radar, also known as GPR.
I'm going to take you out to one of my test graves that I used to teach forensic students on search techniques, and it's ideal to see how the GPR actually works. I can constantly test different types of soil, different objects that are laid in the ground, and see what their signatures will achieve. This is a test grave, and you can see the clear depression. This is 3 years old, but you can clearly see there's something's disturbed that area. It's not normal ground. So we're going to run the scanner over the land, and as I push the machine over, the results will come from the radar head up into the computer, and then I can analyse that using the software. This was the results of the ground radar scan in Peter Tobin's garden in Bathgate. What we've got here, there's lots of red and lots of greens, but if it was an undisturbed ground, we would just have general straight lines. What we've got here is a big jumble of different types of signal, and in particular a large anomaly here, which needed further investigation by the archaeologists.
They dug down over 2 meters, but there was no sign of human remains.
You look back from the evidence from the neighbour, at one stage that was backfilled. And my belief is that Vicky Hamilton had been murdered, she'd been placed into that hole, how long for we don't know, and then moved at a later date.
The team then turned their focus to the loft of the house.
There was a dagger concealed in the corner behind the rafters in a very good hiding place. This was gold dust to us. The knife was put into a forensic tube and whisked off for urgent analysis.
You're looking for trace levels of skin cells or trace levels of blood. What appeared to be skin cells were noted on the knife. They obtained a DNA profile that matched Vicky Hamilton.
16 years later, they finally had conclusive evidence.
We were speechless. It's clear now that Tobin is responsible for the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton.
I says, well, at least we're going somewhere now in this case, but I don't want a knife. I want Vicky. Where's Vicky's body?
"400 miles away in Essex, Operation Anagram uncovered another link to Tobin.
We established from inquiries, Essex Police was dealing with an investigation that could fit the parameters, and that was the missing person, dynamite nickel.
Dinah McNichol was 18 when she attended a music festival in Hampshire in 1991. She decided to hitchhike home, but never arrived.
I was the one who actually raised the issue. I sort of said she should be back, and it was so out of character for her.
There was too many things about her. You know, she had completely disappeared, and there were issues about that where she'd been picked up, her and her boyfriend at that time, got a lift from a nice Scottish man. And then she had some money in her account, and there had been withdrawals from that account on a route, and the route was the route towards Margate.
In 1991, shortly after Vicky's disappearance, Tobin had moved from Bathgate to Kent.
Peter Tobin lived at 50 Irvine Drive in Margate.
Police investigating Dinah's disappearance began a search of the house with forensic teams. It wasn't long before they made a discovery in the garden.
I got the phone call to say that they had found a body, and I thought it was Dinah McNichol, because that's who we went there to look for. And he said, no, it's Vicky Hamilton.
The suspicions that Vicky had been moved from the rockery in the Bathgates garden were confirmed. They had the knife with Vicky's DNA, and now they had her body.
They continued digging, and then they found Dinah buried further along from there.
She'd been bound and gagged, and her body wrapped in rubbish bags. On those bags, police found 4 fingerprints, which they say matched Peter Tobin.
16 years after disappearing, both missing girls could finally be put to rest.
The one thing that we wanted was a body, and so we could have a burial. So as much as it was heartbreaking, it was also sort of a big relief to get her body back. I'm so glad that we found Vicky and that we found the person that did it, and it's all over and done with.
Already serving a life sentence for Angelica's murder, the true extent of Tobin's long criminal past has emerged.
He is a serial sex attacker and killer.
Once again, evidence from expert witnesses was essential to the case against Tobin. It offered the jury a compelling account of his crimes.
Trial lasted for just over a week, and then when they went in to deliberate, I think they were in for 10 minutes. It was for a murder trial. They said it was so quick, it was unheard of.
Peter Tobin received a further 2 life sentences.
We are hoping we can now move on as a family and start to remember Vicky as the loving sister she was before she was so tragically and cruelly taken from us.
Really, really important thing to me is the work that we all did actually help other people hopefully get a little bit of peace.
The forensics, the expert witnesses have been absolutely fantastic. You know, they worked really, really hard to make sure that the Tobin had nowhere to go.
David had identified the killer of Angelica Kluk, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol, and made sure that justice was done. The key to it all was forensic evidence.
I could not have done what I did without the expert witnesses. It is only because of experts that they're able to convict people for crimes like that. The passage of time should not be detrimental to the detection of crime. It shouldn't matter how long it takes to find out the truth. It's a search for the truth, no stone unturned.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. Coming up, we discover how an expert witness helped catch the killer of a woman in a quiet London suburb.
A picture speaks 1,000 words. The fibre evidence was crucial.
And we reveal how an unprecedented police investigation into a serial killer turned to a forensic scientist for help.
There was no guarantees it was going to work. We had to find a way of getting from A to B.
Fibre evidence is probably one of the most underrated evidence types that there is. In almost all crimes, there is a potential the fibres can be crucial evidence.
Carshalton, South London, where on the afternoon of the 24th of March 2009, Maureen Cosgrove was discovered dead in her home.
I was at work on the day. I received a call from my brother. You've got to get to Mum's. Something's happened to Mum. There's police and ambulance there. Don't really know what's going on, but you should be there. I was fairly quickly spoken to by a lady detective. Took me to one side and explained that my mother had passed away. The reasons weren't known. However, they were treating it with suspicious circumstances at that point.
Suspicious circumstances seemed at odds with Maureen's reputation as a loving and caring member of the community.
Mum was a very kind, loving person. She spent most of her time, caring for children and grandchildren. That was her kind of focus on life. Sociable, lots of good friends, loved by most people who met her.
Maureen was discovered by her daughter and her partner. Until recently, the couple had been living with Maureen.
Following the breakup of my youngest sister's marriage, she moved back to the family home. She was struggling to cope at times. Mum welcomed them back in, and Mum sort of took the role of not just supporting my sister, but also, quite almost like a parenting role rather than grandparenting role for the two children.
Now, this caring grandmother had been strangled. Detectives searched for clues to explain why, but found no evidence of a robbery, a break-in, or a stranger's DNA. They turned instead to traces of evidence barely visible to the naked eye.
It first involved DNA examinations, but when they drew a blank, they turned to me to look for fibre evidence. Within the Metropolitan Police at that time, they used a method that was called one-to-one taping. A specific size of tape is applied to the body and it's left in situ, and a second tape is applied directly next to it, and the process is repeated until the entire body is covered in sections of tape. Each tape is numbered, photographed and recorded before being removed. So here we have a fibre taping that is essentially just an adhesive tape, like a sellotape, and we use that to collect anything that sits on the surface of an item, such as a piece of clothing. And then it's just being secured to this clear plastic sheet, which means the evidence is secure and it can then be examined in more detail under the microscope. A fibre map can identify specific areas on a body that have been in contact with another surface. So, for example, if you were wearing a glove and you grabbed an arm, you would expect to find a high concentration in that specific area and none on the rest of the body. It's particularly useful for violent crime, especially crimes that involve strangulation.
Kelly began her analysis of the hundreds of tapings taken from Maureen's body. Meanwhile, detectives considered the method used to kill Maureen: strangulation. Dr. Kerry Nixon, a forensic psychologist, has studied this case in detail.
Strangulation is often committed by somebody known to the victim because you have to get up close and personal. You almost feel that person and their life going. So that is something really difficult to do. And there's recently been a change of law to make even a non-fatal strangulation an offence, because if somebody can place their hands or an object around the throat of an individual, that shows they are a dangerous person.
You know, I was still thinking that it was a burglary gone wrong or something like that. It certainly didn't occur to me that it would be a family member or someone close to the family.
Detectives considered Maureen's family circle and tensions within it.
Maureen's daughter was going through a lot of difficulty in her life. She was an alcoholic, she struggled with that, her life was in turmoil. She had children and she was struggling to look after them, so she decided to move back into Maureen's home, and this offered a sense of stability for her.
Her situation seemed to improve further when she met George Mabon outside a hospital.
He seemed like a nice guy and they started to see each other. Her mum and the whole family thought he was supportive and thought he would be good for her. Maureen even allowed him to come and stay in her house, which is a huge gesture of goodwill. Initially it was okay, but very slowly things began to change and the relationship between Maureen and Mabon soured.
I think the tension between Mum and George Mabon developed because she became frustrated that he was there all the time, but he wasn't actually contributing anyway, either financially or physically, really.
He just started to disrespect Maureen and her house. He wouldn't tidy up things away after himself. He would be lying on the sofa. He'd flick his cigarettes into her garden, and her garden was her pride and joy. It's the actions of a man who thinks he's superior to Maureen and is in control of his situation, and she dares to question him.
The tension and friction got worse after my sister fell pregnant. My mum's view was that he should be out actively looking for some form of employment, you know, looking to how he was going to support my sister and her family, you know, if he was going to play that partner role. And he didn't really seem to want to do that. And I know Mum became incredibly frustrated, and it actually got to the point where she actually said to him that he was no longer welcome to live in the home.
Police now had a reason to suspect Mabon of Maureen's murder. They took the unusual step of placing a surveillance device in his car. They were shocked at what it revealed.
He gives them a confession where he says, "Please God, forgive me, what have I done? She just pushed me to this. I couldn't cope with it any longer." But even though that confession was fantastic evidence, because he didn't refer actually to Maureen's murder, they still have to meticulously investigate the crime in order to gather as much evidence as possible to deliver at trial to secure a conviction.
Detectives needed to go further and find evidence to prove Mabon committed the murder. His DNA was found all over the crime scene, but that was easily explained because he had lived in the house.
One of the concerns with the forensic evidence in general is that he had legitimate access to the scene from living there. So any forensic evidence that was found could have been there as a result of legitimate access rather than being there as a result of him having any involvement in Maureen's death.
Detectives needed to link Mabon to the strangulation itself. Now, Kelly's fibre analysis offered compelling evidence to do just that. Mabon was seen on CCTV wearing a brown coat.
So the first stage of examination was to search the tapings for fibres that could have come from this particular coat. The number of tapings in this case, I think, came to in the region of 150. So it's a lot of time spent at the microscope examining those tapings in detail.
Kelly was able to identify an abundance of foreign brown fibres on Maureen's clothing, which she now compared to Mabon's coat.
We were able to examine it to determine, first of all, whether it shed fibres, and it did. 2 different types of brown polyester fibre and also brown cotton fibres. So we had 3 different fibre types that became our target fibres that we then searched the one-to-one tapes for. Essentially, we take a sample of fibres from the brown coat, and we take our individual fibres that we recovered onto a slide from the tapings. And when you hit upon a fibre that is the right shade, the right colour, you know instinctively that you have a match.
Kelly's comparisons in the lab proved the brown fibres on Maureen's clothing were a match for fibres from Mabon's coat, but Kelly was able to go even further.
We also determined that there was a much higher concentration around the back of the clothing and also around the neck area, which is what you might have expected if somebody wearing that coat had strangled Maureen.
The presence of brown coat fibres was not the only incriminating evidence Kelly identified. She also found traces of distinctive blue fibres.
These specific fibres were concentrated more around the front and then just the top neck area of Maureen. When we presented this with the police, they asked us the types of garments that they could have come from, and often acrylic fibres will be used in gloves.
Once again, detectives studied the CCTV footage of Mabon, but they couldn't see him wearing blue gloves in the hours prior to Maureen's death, nor were any gloves found among his property.
What we were able to do at that stage was to look at the tapings that were taken from the pockets of the coat, and lo and behold, we found matching blue acrylic fibres in there.
This was compelling evidence that Mabon had worn the blue gloves while strangling Maureen, and Kelly was able to reveal one final link to prove he had been in close physical contact with her.
We further strengthened the link by searching for fibres that were from the clothing Maureen was wearing, and we were able to find matching fibres of them on the coat. In terms of fibre evidence, this is probably one of the strongest cases that I've ever worked on. There were multiple fibre links going in multiple directions. It was really overwhelming evidence, and particularly in the absence of DNA, a picture speaks 1,000 words. The fibre evidence was crucial.
Police now charged Mabon with the murder of Maureen Cosgrove, and in October 2009, he faced trial.
Trial was a very difficult time, but it was also a very enlightening process. You know, the fibre analysis is incredible, the work they do. You know, the fact that they were able to take microscopic fibres that you wouldn't necessarily see, that actually clearly indicated that he'd been holding her from behind.
George Mabon was found guilty and was ultimately sentenced to 17 years in prison.
I was elated when I heard the verdict. You kind of feel that justice has been achieved because someone's been found responsible and held to account for their actions.
I was really pleased for the family when the verdict came in. It was clearly a very traumatic case emotionally, and I was just pleased that the forensic science was able to help.
Forensic science is important in almost every major investigation. It's almost always a team effort requiring dialogue between experts and investigators, but it doesn't provide all the answers.
The village of Stow, Scotland, in 1990. A man gardening sees a young girl snatched from the street and driven away in a van. Police officer Tom Wood was heavily involved in the investigation.
He saw her legs disappear into the van, and he quickly phoned the police.
One officer was horrified by the details of the alert.
The local policeman recognised the description as being his daughter, so he drove as fast as he could across the village of Stow.
The policeman quickly found the eyewitness, who began to describe in more detail what he saw.
And all of a sudden, he sees the same van driving back through the village of Stow. Quite simply, the policeman stopped the vehicle and then went round and opened the van. And the van is full of stuff. And right at the bottom, there is a sack-like sleeping bag kind of thing. And he finds his daughter in it.
The van driver was arrested on the spot and charged. His name was Robert Black.
Very, very quickly, he is tried for the abduction. And so serious is the abduction that he receives a life sentence. But the judge made it very, very clear that he viewed this as being only by the luck and the grace of God was this not a murder.
Police quickly linked the methodology of this abduction with 3 other cases that police forces across the country had been attempting to solve. All involved children. The first was the murder 8 years earlier in 1982 of 11-year-old Susie Maxwell.
We lived on a farm called Cramond Hill, which is just on the English side of the border, and Susie's tennis club was in Coldstream, just on the other side of the border. It was a lovely place to grow up. It's idyllic, beautiful, the last place in the world you'd ever expect something like this to happen.
She's last seen at 4:30 p.m. walking down the road in her tennis gear with her tennis racket to cross the bridge to go from Lothian and Borders area, Scotland, into England and to her home at Cornhill and Tweed. She's never seen alive again. 12 days later, human remains were found in a lay-by in Staffordshire, and we found out that unfortunately it was indeed Susie.
Her brother Tom was just a toddler when this happened.
It's just shocking. I still have trouble believing that it happened. And sometimes it feels like it's a bad dream you're going to wake up from, but you don't.
Almost a year later, in July 1983, the seaside town of Portobello, near Edinburgh, was rocked by the disappearance, in similar circumstances, of 5-year-old Caroline Hogg.
Caroline lived there, lived in Beach Lane with her family, and the day she went missing, she'd been at a party and she'd come home, but she was still wearing her wee party dress when she went out to play with friends, and she was never seen again. Very early on, we had a report of a little girl who looked like Caroline being seen on or near the promenade around the time she disappeared with a particularly scruffy-looking man who was described as being in his 40s with a sort of unshaven, unkempt, sort of dirty appearance.
Caroline's body was found 10 days later, 300 miles away in Leicestershire. 3 years later, in 1986, Sarah Jane Harper went missing on her way home from the local shop in Morley, Leeds. her body was found in the River Trent near Wilford in Nottingham. The cases of Susie Maxwell, Caroline Hogg and Sarah Jane Harper had all gone unsolved. But now, in 1990, years after the murders, detectives asked if Robert Black could be responsible.
Robert Black is a solitary person, a loner, a sort of dirty, unkept individual, born in Scotland and spends some of his childhood in Scotland, but then drifts south and becomes a delivery driver. And Black, being a loner, being a bachelor, having no family, he volunteers for these long drives. And he's driven on the continent, he's been in Ireland, and he's been all over Scotland. We knew then, of course, that these cases were linked. There were too many similarities in terms of the abduction and in terms of the deposition of the bodies.
Detectives now needed to find evidence to prove Black was connected to all three crimes. They searched his flat and seized a wealth of exhibits, hoping these could reveal hidden evidence. Then turned to forensic investigator Jim Fraser.
The question the police had in their minds was there any way that Black could be forensically linked or eliminated to any of the victims? So that could mean any kind of forensic evidence, for example, fibres or hairs or body fluids.
The main problem for Jim was the sheer number of pieces of potential evidence that had been taken from Black's flat.
There were somewhere around 4,000 potential items to be examined. The lab at Lothian Borders just simply wasn't big enough. What then we agreed was that we would target items much more carefully. Yes, we would screen everything, but we wouldn't tape everything for hairs and fibres. So within a few days, we had screened the items to somewhere around 300 items, which we could then examine them in laboratory conditions.
The team also came up with an innovative approach to streamline the process.
Rather than do the transfer from Black to the victims, what we did was we took every single fibre from the items of the victims and we put it in a database. So if a fibre was red, it was either synthetic or natural. Then there would be a subcategory. There might be red acrylic fibres and red nylon fibres. There would be red, blue, green, black cottons. There would be red, blue, green, black wool fibres and so on and so forth.
If Jim could match fibres from Black's possessions to those found on the victims and vice versa, he could tie Black to the murders.
We generated comparisons between Black's items and the hundreds of individual fibres recovered from the missing children. That method had never been done before, as far as I understand. There was no guarantees it was going to work, but we had to find a way of getting from A to B. When you're working with fibres, you're not used to quick hits. So there is always that issue of kind of managing expectations and saying, this is how far we have got, we haven't found it yet. We worked in shifts, more or less on and off, for about 6 months.
After 6 months of intensive work, the fibres hadn't produced any useful evidence, and Jim moved on to examining any hairs that had been found on the exhibit. In the early 90s, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, and so Jim relied on more basic techniques.
You look down a microscope, you put the hairs side by side, and you make a subjective judgment about whether they look similar. Not the same, they pretty much never look exactly the same. They look similar. And even if they look similar, it doesn't mean that they've come from that person. So there was this single body hair found in Susan Maxwell, which I had concluded couldn't be from her because it was a body hair, she was a young child. The problem I had was that the sample from Black had been taken at least 9 years later. The only way I could compare it reasonably with Black is if I had samples taken from Black at around the time that the crime was committed.
The hair was of limited value. Fibres hadn't linked Black to the murders, and Jim's extensive forensic investigation was coming to a disappointing conclusion.
I'd probably visually examined thousands of items in detail, thousands if not tens of thousands of fibres. The outcome of the examination was the single hair found on Susan Maxwell and a tiny indication of a body fluid stain that was found amongst Black's belongings.
This time, forensic science hadn't been able to reveal the evidence police were hoping for. Instead, investigators had to rely on old-fashioned detective work and came up with a promising lead.
Black works for an old-fashioned transport company that keep meticulous records. In the company headquarters, there are thousands of petrol receipts. You can actually track where Black was at any point in time in his working career.
The petrol receipts placed Black in the vicinity at the time of each of the abductions. They also placed him along the routes to the 3 sites where the bodies were hidden. Other evidence, including the identical methodology, was enough for Robert Black to be tried for triple murder. Black pleaded not guilty, but on the 19th of May, 1994, he was convicted and sentenced to a minimum of 35 years.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but there is no justice because you cannot equate the life of Susie or any of those other little girls with Robert Black. There is no comparison. So no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
Black was later found guilty of a 4th murder, this one of 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy in Northern Ireland in 1981. Detectives believe Black could have been responsible for even more. He died in prison in 2016. For Jim, this is a case he'll never forget.
Even though it came to nothing in the end, we did some innovative work in the case, but I think it would have given me some satisfaction to have played a more direct role in the conviction of Robert Black.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
We're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we're in Northern Ireland to find out how a ballistics expert was brought in to help crack the case of a mysterious shooting.
My task was really to concentrate on the test fires from that one suspect rifle.
And in Wiltshire, a handwriting expert examines a suspicious signature after a man's wife goes missing.
First thing I had to do was determine whether or not the Natalie Williams signature was a genuine signature written by Natalie herself. If it wasn't, to determine whether or not Randall Williams could have forged that signature.
Every firearm tells a story. The manufacturing leaves marks, and it's those marks that we can actually use to trace spent cartridge cases or bullets back to that particular gun. Even if it's recovered many years later, we can trace it and trace it back to crimes that it was used in.
April 2005, St Patrick's Primary School, Molnaskee, near Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. The children are enjoying their lunch break outdoors in the spring sunshine when suddenly the playground assistant notices that 4-year-old Dara Summers has fallen over. Dara is picked up and walked inside to the headmaster at the time, Bernard O'Connor.
A typical young 4-year-old kid. Wee Dara was given the impression that he was all right, that he was okay, but he had a sore head. And when the playground assistant looked at his head, she saw a little mark of blood at the back of his head.
Following school policy for even minor head injuries, an ambulance was called to take Dara to the nearby hospital.
One of the teachers went with Dara in the ambulance to the hospital, and he was conscious, he was talking in the ambulance. But on the way into the hospital, which was only 4 or 5 minutes away, he began to get dizzy and his eyes began to roll in his head. So we knew that it was quite a serious head injury. But again, we thought it was still a fall. It was nothing more than a fall.
But an X-ray of Dara's head revealed that this was something much more sinister.
An hour later, there's a phone call from the hospital that they had suspected that the child had a bullet wound in his head, that he'd been shot. This was a shocking kind of thing. I was absolutely dumbfounded that there would be even a thought of an incident like this happen at school, never mind to think that there was a bullet in this child's head, but there was. The child was immediately brought from Enniskillen Hospital to the Royal Victoria in Belfast, to the Children's Hospital there, and the surgeons had a major task on their hand as to what they were going to do. The bullet went in the back of the skull, directly in the centre of the back of the skull, and it hit the forehead bone here and stayed inside in the brain. And the surgeon took a piece out of the front of the child's forehead and went in and took the bullet out that way. The child was unconscious after that.
With Dara's life hanging in the balance, detectives worked to figure out how he had been shot.
We were very adamant and very clear that this couldn't have happened in the school. And then to feel that a bullet had come from somewhere else. That was the huge mystery that we couldn't understand.
Police had just one piece of evidence, the bullet removed from Dara's head. They handed it to ballistics expert Philip Boyce for forensic analysis.
This is a cartridge of the same caliber and type of bullet as that used in the incident. It's a .22 caliber long rifle cartridge with a copper wash bullet and a hollow point. At the point of impact, the hollow point expands and the bullet will change shape, flattening its head.
Much like this example, the bullets removed from Dara's skull had been misshapen at the point of impact. This meant that much of the detail Philip hoped to glean from it was destroyed. Luckily though, he was able to make out some identifying marks.
As the bullet travels up the barrel, it actually gets marked up with rifling marks on the side of the bullet. On a bullet this small, the rifling actually looks like scratch marks on it, and no other bullet will have those same rifling characteristics. The bullet effectively has changed forever.
Crucially, the rifling on the bullet that struck Dara adhered to a particular pattern.
It was rifled 16 grooves right-hand twist, which is a signature for multi-groove rifles of the Marlin type. As a consequence, the police in Northern Ireland recovered 14 rifles within a 5-mile radius of the school that were of the same make. A standard little hunting rifle used for small game. It is powerful enough to shoot pigeons or rabbits, but it will cause grave injury to a human being.
Now that detectives knew the type of weapon responsible for Dara's injuries, they began to form a theory on what had happened.
Police say it was a hunting accident. The shot probably fired from nearby fields. But so far, no one has come forward. And today, Dara's father left his son's hospital bedside for the first time to make an appeal to the person who fired the shot.
The person that did this, it was a terrible accident. So it was. And I have no doubt in my mind that they're feeling the strain of it. And they've an awful weight to bear at this time. So if he could even find it in himself to come forward, it would be so much better.
Despite this appeal, no one came forward. It was now down to Philip to find the identity of the shooter. To do this, he would need to definitively link the bullet taken from Dara's head back to one of the 14 rifles. This meant collecting samples.
I had to test fire every single rifle into a medium of cotton wool on Kevlar fibre. You can actually see that they penetrated the first bag. This stops the bullet actually expanding and changing shape. The advantage of this is that I have the full surface of the bullet for comparison purposes on the comparison microscope. And even though it's hollow point, you can actually see that it hasn't changed shape.
Immediately, the pool of 14 rifles was narrowed down.
I was able to exclude 2 of those rifles straight away because whilst they were multi-grooved, there were 20 grooves right-hand twist and not 16. So I had already excluded 2 of the rifles on my initial examination. My next task was to go to London, to the Metropolitan Police, and use their IBIS system. And the IBIS system is an integrated ballistics identification system which actually scans the bullets and searches it against a database.
The database contains records of the rifling marks created by every different type of firearm. Philip uploaded all 12 test fires and checked them solely against the bullets recovered from Dara Summers. It did not conclusively match one of the guns. However, it did consistently identify one rifle as the most likely match to the bullet.
My task was really to concentrate on the test fires from that one suspect rifle. In doing so, I used a comparison microscope for a complete weekend. And at the end of the weekend, out of all the 20 bullets that I test fired from that rifle, I could only with certainty say that it matched at least one of them. I asked a colleague called Chet Park to peer review and have a look at it. And he said, there's too much agreement for it to be a coincidence. And I said to him, what does that mean? And he said, it's a match.
The rifle was registered to local man Fergus Cleary. He admitted to carrying the weapon in a field about 500 metres from Dara's school at the time of the shooting, but denied firing it. So Philip set about calculating the bullet's trajectory.
The bullet would have been travelling at 204 metres per second. I worked out that in order to actually hit the child in the region of 457 metres away, the rifle would have to be aimed 14.5 metres above him and 1 metre to the left.
This showed the bullets could have been fired by Cleary from the field, possibly while aiming at birds in the sky. But could it also have caused Dara's precise injuries? Philip needed to find out.
I duplicated the child's wound by shooting a synthetic skull filled with ballistic gelatin and completely duplicated the path of the bullet. I also had the skull CAT scanned and then reconstructed in 3 dimensions to show the potential injuries to the inside of the skull, and it virtually replicated the injuries to the child. This is the X-ray of the child, and you can see the bullet lodged inside the front of his skull. This is an X-ray of the synthetic skull, and you can see that the bullet has stopped virtually identically in the same place as it did in the child. And when I recovered this bullet from the synthetic skull, it was almost an identical replica to the bullet from the child's head.
Philip's evidence was overwhelming. Fergus Cleary was charged with unlawfully and maliciously wounding Dara Summers, and the case set for trial.
I was prepared to go to court, but in the 11th hour, the person who owned the main suspect gun actually pleaded guilty. I believe that was as the result of my evidence, because basically my evidence actually said, without a shadow of doubt, that bullet was discharged from that gun.
Surgery to remove that bullet from Dara's head had left him in a coma. His parents could only pray he would pull through.
The mother sat at that child's bed and never left it for 6 weeks. And the nurses used to say to Dara every morning, she used to say, if you can feel Mummy's hand, give it a squeeze. And of course, nothing would happen. And here one morning after 6 weeks, when they said, give Mummy's hand a wee squeeze, and the wee hand squeezed. And that was the first light of success.
Miraculously, Dara recovered after the shooting, and although he was partially blinded in one eye, he was fit to return to school just 4 months later.
It was a celebration day, the day that Dara came back into the school. Really, we couldn't believe that we had Dara back. I mean, it's a miracle that that child's alive. I have to compliment Philip Boyce on his unbelievably brilliant work to specifically relate a particular bullet to a particular gun. Massive bit of science work, incredible.
Following his guilty plea, Fergus Cleary was fined £5,000, with the judge stating the case was a clear reminder of the dangers posed by firearms.
I mean, nobody was purposely taking a weapon out and firing a shot at the school playground, you know. But unfortunately, they were pigeon shooting or something like that on the day that this happened, and a bullet had strayed in that direction.
Personally, this case was very satisfying for me in that there's cases where you just physically cannot match that bullet back to the gun. And it was very rewarding whenever I actually got, not the answer that I wanted, but the actual answer that was in the evidence.
Forensic handwriting identification has many uses, but perhaps one of the most powerful and perhaps satisfying is to prove intent or premeditation.
Wiltshire, April 2002. 33-year-old beauty consultant Natalie Williams took her dog for a walk one evening and never returned home. She was reported missing by her 43-year-old husband, Randall Williams. Journalist Craig Every covered the case.
Randall Williams and his wife Natalie married in Hampshire in 1997, and they moved to Bradford-on-Avon because he owned a IT company in Bath. They bought a very expensive house. It was a converted mill house, and the River Avon runs through it.
In the early hours of the 23rd of April, Randall phoned police to say his wife left for a walk with their dog at 11 p.m. Now the dog had come home, but there was no sign of Natalie.
Police officers were dispatched to Greenham Mills, which is the house that Randall and Natalie shared, and became suspicious of Randall's behaviour, the fact that there was puddles of water in the bath and the washing machine was on. He was reporting a missing person, but there were signs that something was wrong.
Meanwhile, the search for Natalie continued until the next morning. Police found her body in the River Avon, close to the couple's home.
Natalie Williams' body was found submerged in the river 2 days after her husband reported her missing.
It became clear her death was not accidental.
A forensic post-mortem examination was carried out, and it determined that Natalie had died from a combination of strangulation and possibly drowning.
Detectives were now running a murder inquiry and began to investigate the couple's relationship. They discovered Randall was jealous and controlling and had even attacked neighbours he thought might be having an affair with Natalie.
He showed a pattern of obsessive, compulsive, manipulative behaviour towards people he was in a relationship with. He was prone to jealous outbursts. He also was a man who had great propensity to lie.
Detectives were convinced Randall was responsible for Natalie's murder. They arrested him, but he insisted he was innocent.
He was interviewed over the course of the next couple of days. He gave police a very detailed account of his movements and of the searches he'd carried out of railway tunnels and woodlands and streets in the hope of finding Natalie.
Police even found a note Randall had left Natalie asking her to ring him because he was out looking for her. Detectives needed more evidence.
Wiltshire Police took the decision to release him on bail and then monitored his movements, following which he was then viewed to go to a disused lay-by near Warminster in Wiltshire twice within the space of 48 hours. Police carried out a search of that lay-by and found a number of items of clothing and a rug.
Detectives asked whether these finds could link Randall to Natalie's murder and sent them for forensic analysis. Meanwhile, they looked more closely at Randall Williams' business affairs.
Randall Williams presented himself as a man of great success. He said he had wealth, he had status symbols in terms of expensive cars and expensive house, but this all masks what the reality was, that he was hugely in debt. Police were able to find out that this IT company went into liquidation in February 2002, which was just before Natalie went missing. He had a mountain of loans that he couldn't pay back, and he'd even borrowed £70,000 off a business partner, he said, to buy a retirement home for his parents, when in fact he used the money to buy a £43,000 Porsche Boxster for his wife.
It was clear to detectives Randall Williams' success was just a web of lies. But one document among his files stood out.
One of the significant discoveries of the police investigation was that Randall Williams had applied to an insurance company to take out life insurance for himself and his wife, Natalie. This would be a substantial payout should one of them die, and during the course of the application, he was given accidental death cover.
Randall had applied for the policy just weeks before Natalie died. She appeared to have signed the policy, but was her signature genuine? Detectives turned to expert witness Paul Bagnall, a scientist with a background in biology and archaeology who became an expert in forensic documentation while working at the Home Office.
So I'd been furnished with the background of the information and that they were very suspicious of a legal charge attached to an insurance policy that had been taken out by Randall Williams. And they asked me to make a detailed examination and identification of the two signatures on that document.
The life insurance policy was to pay out £665,000 should one of them die. If Natalie's signature was forged, it could be evidence that Randall planned her murder in order to pay off his massive debts.
First thing I had to do was determine whether or not the Natalie Williams signature was a genuine signature written by Natalie herself. And then secondly, if it wasn't, to determine whether or not Randall Williams could have forged that signature.
Paul began his analysis of the signature. He carefully studied how the letters had been formed, and he compared them to samples of Natalie's handwriting.
Some people make a signature that comprises a small piece of handwriting. And the scale goes right the way through to people who do swirling, flourished, stylized signatures without any obvious, discernible letter constructions. And of course, we have a sliding scale in between. These signatures were a little bit of both. The capital letters on the first and second names were a little bit stylized, but essentially the core of the first and second names were just pieces of handwriting. The more stylized elements of the Natalie Williams signature appeared similar pictorially, but under a microscope, the execution of them was not correct. The actual basic handwriting was very dissimilar from the specimens of Natalie Williams, both in construction and in fluency and in execution. So that enabled me to conclude that the signature was not written by her. In other words, it was not a genuine signature of Natalie Williams written by her.
Paul's analysis showed that Randall's signature, meanwhile, was genuine. It led detectives to ask if it could have been he who forged Natalie's name.
We have the larger, more obvious, stylized features of the Natalie Williams signature appearing to look like hers, but not executed in the correct way. That's quite indicative of forgery. In addition to that, the actual core of the handwriting of the Natalie Williams signature was very similar in detail and fluency to the specimens of Randall Williams. It was, in essence, his handwriting.
Investigators now had proof that Randall Williams had taken out life insurance policies in his wife's name, forged her signature without her knowledge, and all just weeks before Natalie was murdered.
Following Natalie's disappearance and subsequently her body being found, he tried to call the insurance company and claim on this life insurance, which he was clearly doing to try and cover the financial black hole that he was in.
Detectives were now in no doubt about Randall's motive, but they had more proof. Analysis of the clothing and rug found in the lay-by visited by Randall in the days after Natalie's death revealed traces of river water and mud from the same spot where her body was found, together with his DNA.
Randall Williams was charged with Natalie's murder and he stood trial at Bristol Crown Court.
Randall Williams kept up a long pretense of the grieving husband at his wife's funeral, at her grave, and during his trial. Throughout the whole ordeal, he maintained his innocence.
Paul Bagnall's expert handwriting evidence was crucial in showing the murder had been carefully premeditated by Randall.
The evidence that was presented by the expert witness really did cement in the jury's mind the police and prosecution case that Randall was a habitual liar and that he had a strong financial motive for wanting to kill Natalie.
Arrogant, cold-blooded and ruthless is how the police describe Randall Williams. Williams was found guilty after telling the court that he loved his wife, but that problems in their marriage had been caused by her infidelity.
On the 11th of July 2003, Randall Williams was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife.
This has been a long and arduous trial for Natalie Williams' family. To this day, they found it difficult to come to terms with her death.
Randall Williams created a profile of lies about Natalie to discredit her and other innocent people, to disguise his guilt, and in doing so, he has revealed his true depraved character.
Even though the circumstances surrounding this case were particularly tragic, it does show the value and the worth of forensic handwriting identification with regards to the whole case context and how a case may be proven. And that is incredibly rewarding, and those are the little rewards that lead to job satisfaction of being an expert witness.